Okay, why don't we get started? Good morning. My name is John Denny. I'm a research professor of national security studies at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. That's the SSI, the research arm of the War College. And I'm joined today by a group of 6 resident students from the current academic year 2016 class at the U.S. Army War College. These 6 students have spent the last almost year, this academic year, researching and writing on whether and how the Army is prepared to respond to security challenges in Europe. And the team specifically looked at the challenge that Russia poses to American interests in Europe. That study, their research efforts were sponsored by both U.S. Army Europe and the U.S. European Command. And their research efforts now have resulted in a book, the cover of which is to my right here. The book is available for downloading for free from the SSI website. It will be in about a week or two. And this event is a book launch event for that book. The SSI website, incidentally, is www.strategicstudiesinstitute.army.mil. If you check out this QR code we have on the book cover, or if you go to the website now, you'll see a page available for that product, and we'll be posting it just as soon as it is ready. We'll also have hard copies of that available if any of you are interested. You can get in touch with me. So for today's book launch event, we're going to discuss the major findings of that research effort, as well as the major recommendations. And so we've brought down all of the 6 students to speak to you, our live audience here, as well as our virtual audience. And we welcome the virtual audience watching online today on the live web stream that we have. For those of you that are watching virtually, we welcome your participation in the event through Twitter. You can tweet any questions you have to my Twitter address, which is @JohnRDenny, all one word, @JohnRDenny, when we get to the Q&A phase of this presentation, and I will be glad to field those questions and present them to the students. So, without further ado, let me briefly introduce each of the 6 students, and then I'll ask them a series of questions. We're going to try to keep this as interactive as possible, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. To my immediate left, and then going down further to my left, is Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Jay Vaughn, followed by Army Lieutenant Colonel Reed Anderson, and Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Alamo Renegar, Army Colonel Pat Ellis. I just spent the drive 2 hours from Carlisle down here with Pat. You'd think I know his last name by now. And then next to Pat Ellis is Army Lieutenant Colonel Kyle Reed. And then finally at the far end is Army Lieutenant Colonel Tony Paz. So let me start by asking Jay first. Jay, let's start at the beginning of this question, whether the Army is prepared for these challenges. Tell me first about what you and the group found with regard to the challenge, specifically Russia, the nature of the threat, the motives behind Russian actions. What did you find unique or special about that?
Thanks, John. Well, for my research, I kind of traced, Putin's presidential terms all the way back to the time he was prime minister, and then his time growing up in the FSB and the KGB. We know we're dealing with a Russia that's, sort of struggling to find its place in the world, so that is a cause for somewhat of its aggressive behavior. We saw that in Georgia in 2008, and then again in Ukraine in 2014. So Russia is asserting its military power, it's modernizing in order to kind of find its place back in the world. I think Putin wants to have a place at the table and be internationally respected, and that's what we've kind of seen in a lot of his rhetoric and his speech in Valdai, his New World Order speech, and comments in Munich. And if you look sort of back at the security strategy of Russia under Medvedev, you'll see that they are very interested in sort of toppling the United States as a unipolar actor, and they want a place at the table in this domain of multipolarity, respect. We see that kind of all through his tenure, his desire for respect and to be a part of the world stage again. And the challenge, I think, for us as we go forward is, Putin doesn't really believe in NATO as a security institution, and that's going to work out for Russia. So I think he's going to continue to do actions to sort of vilify NATO and discredit NATO and sort of really stretch the bonds of NATO with regard to Article 3 and Article 5 until, at some point NATO won't be a viable security institution anymore, and then Russia can sort of reshape the stage as it sees fit.
Jay, do you think the threat is mostly about Putin, or do you think it's broader than just Putin? In other words, if Putin were to leave the stage tomorrow, do you think we'd still face U.S. interests and NATO allies would still face the same challenges?
I don't think Putin is really the center of gravity for what's going on in Russia. If you kind of look back to, I guess your average Russian is a little frightened about the future, and they have this craving for security. They went through reforms under Gorbachev that kind of splintered the Soviet Union. Then they dealt with Yeltsin, sort of his ad hoc leadership style and sort of giving the country away. And Putin has kind of come back on the stage with this, I'm a protector, I'm a savior of Russia. And he pushed that down to Medvedev. In my opinion, I think Medvedev was somewhat of a puppet under Putin. Putin was able to shape him as the prime minister, and now that he's back on the stage, I think he's going to be there for a while. But if Putin were to leave, your average Russian coming behind him is going to kind of take that stead, I think.
Let me ask you now to take a step further into sort of the operational weeds for us. Tell me, looking beyond the sort of strategic level, do you think this is the primary challenge a conventional one? Is it more what we've heard about it in terms of hybrid or ambiguous threats, or is it a combination? What's your sense of what the primary challenge is operationally?
Well, I touched on this a little bit. I think one of the biggest challenges is how we're going to deal with Russia in the future. I think they need to be engaged diplomatically. I think militarily, it's going to be more of a nuanced effect. We definitely don't want to go conventional force to force, because then we sort of get back into the Russian mindset of zero-sum game, where there is no compromise really. They have to win and we have to lose, or vice versa at the same time. If we continue to, I won't say challenge them militarily, but if we get back into this matching of force on force, it'll become another Cold War. We'll do something, we'll escalate, they'll escalate, and then we may possibly trip the nuclear ladder. So it's something to kind of deal with. I think we need to sort of work with resiliency with our NATO partners and increase the security of the institution.
All right, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Reed Anderson, let me ask you, given the nature of the threat that Jay's outlined for us here, what's your sense of whether we need to kind of reconceptualize how it is we manage Russia specifically in terms of deterring Russia, reassuring allies? What's your sense of what we need to do differently?
Well, thanks, John. I think the first thing that we need to do, and that we saw through our research and our discussions, particularly with leadership over in Europe, is first we need to understand what deterrence is. And until we can understand what deterrence is, we won't be able to target the appropriate and right-sized activities. And so what we looked at is taking the threats into consideration and what deterrence is in terms of costs and benefits. What is the right way to approach deterrence in Europe with Russia? And as Jay mentioned, there is the conventional threat, even though that's probably not likely that Putin's going to take conventional forces to attack alliance territory. It's nevertheless a threat that must be considered, particularly when you look at how they've been increasing their capabilities, increasing the number of forces in the Western Military District. That is something that the alliance needs to consider. When you look at where the alliance has been over the last 20 years, we all downsized at the end of the Cold War. Budgets have gone down. And over the last 15 years, the alliance has really been focused on expeditionary operations, which means its capabilities for the collective defense of the alliance have diminished over time. So the alliance is in a predicament right now where it does not have the appropriate capabilities to be able to deter a conventional threat against Russia, regardless of the likelihood of that threat. So that's one thing that the alliance needs to work on collectively is how do we deter a conventional threat? And it's not just a U.S. solution. It's an alliance solution. The alliance has got to do it together to increase the capability such that it would increase the cost to Russia should it choose to conduct a conventional attack into alliance territory. And one thing to consider here is Article 5 by itself has a deterrent effect, but that has to be backed up by capable and credible forces. But as Jay mentioned, that's not the only threat that we face with Russia. John, you mentioned ambiguous threats, hybrid warfare. In our work, we use the term ambiguous warfare or ambiguous threats, but that encompasses what we know as hybrid warfare and also any other type of means that Russia could use in an umbrella of ambiguity. For example, leveraging using economic levers in Europe, using political levers in Europe, for example, like funding European political parties, cyber attacks, all things that can be done to increase influence, fracture the alliance without having to resort to an armed attack. So we call those ambiguous threats. The challenge is how do you deter against an ambiguous threat? And that is you can do that by denying them the opportunity, the ability to be able to conduct those activities. And as Jay mentioned, resiliency. This is about European countries building within their own countries the ability to detect, respond to these kind of threats. And this goes well beyond the alliance. This requires, in terms of the United States support to European allies, this requires a complete DoD effort, a whole-of-government approach, and requires cooperation between the alliance and the European Union as well.
All right, thank you. Alamo, let me turn to you next. As Reed described, let's assume that Russia can be deterred, and assurance is achievable with regard to our allies. What are the primary challenges that you saw in your research that face the U.S. in trying to achieve those two objectives specifically, deterrence and reassurance?
Thanks, John. So as the audience is aware, there's a lot going on in Europe, just like there is anywhere in the world. You have an alliance, most successful alliance in the world, I think most people would say, but the alliance is dealing with a lot of issues. I mean, you've got mass migration in the south, you have a Eurozone issues that people are dealing with, you have energy issues, and then Russia decides to do what it's doing and get Eastern Europe kind of excited. So there's something going on. I mean, we clearly, we have to look at it. And so as a group, we traveled over to Europe, and we're going to address the NATO alliance in general, but for me, I kind of took an American point of view to see what the American Army could do, and that's kind of where I focused in on specifically. And we've seen hundreds of events, literally hundreds of events. The European Leadership Network identified 80 events in 8 months that are violations of sovereign airspace, close encounters at sea, SNAP exercises, things that have got the alliance concerned. So not to mention, we had a President Obama went to Tallinn, Estonia, and made a promise that American military would be there for our Baltic friends. This is an Article 5 issue. So for us, it made American leadership, U.S. military leadership kind of go, the boss has laid down this kind of policy at a podium, and so what are we going to do? How are we going to look at this? So that's what we did, and we went around and tried to look at what we could do. And U.S. Army Europe, United States Air Forces Europe have been busy. They're doing a lot of stuff. I think 50 events, battalion or larger, this past year. And we had to kind of look at it and say, what does that look like to Russia? Does that look like an organized, focused effort to reassure partners, reassure allies, or did it look kind of like we're just doing something to do something? So we wanted to take a look at that and kind of focus in on that. And one of the things that came out of this, John, is that there is no more headquarters left in Europe to organize this. And what I mean by headquarters, I mean a joint task force warfighting type headquarters that can manage this kind of operation if this thing were to escalate, and more importantly, focus the stuff that's going on with the new Operation Atlantic Resolve that we're doing over there, and the European Reassurance Initiative, which, as you know, has put a lot of money into that part of the world. And so as the strategic calculus changed in Europe for America, we reduced headquarters over there and brought it back to the States. And so there's no headquarters over there to do that. So you have U.S. Army Europe struggling to do the day-to-day organized, train, and equip mission, getting the forces ready, but you have no operational headquarters over there. So one of the first things we saw is that we need to return an assigned headquarters back into Europe to run this day-to-day business. And I think what this may end up doing is, the discussion now is this escalatory? Is this going to cause a problem? Or is it going to show that, is it going to maintain those long-term relationships? Is it going to let Operation Atlantic Resolve tie in with the NATO alliance, which my colleague, Colonel Ellis here, will talk about next. But we see the need for that. And right now there's a mission command element that we're sending over there. It's about a 90-person team, but that's not an enduring thing. That rotates out, and so you lose those relationships. And if you want to talk just the basic small stuff, you've got American forces that aren't familiar with European bridge heights or bridging options, different stuff, because we've lost some of that institutional knowledge as we pulled our forces out of Europe. The second thing we noticed is the 2005 Basing Commission in the United States suggested that as we withdraw forces from Europe, that we don't completely withdraw our armor forces. But as I mentioned earlier, the calculus had changed, and we felt the armor was no longer needed over there. Our allies as well, the alliance writ large, has removed armor forces. I think the Germans had 2,000 tanks just 10, 15 years ago, and now they have 250, and I think they're buying 100 more in the news right now. So as opposed to the Russian Western Military District has 22 mechanized battalion tactical groups in its Western Military District alone. So there's a balance of power there that's missing. And so it's not necessarily about escalating or tit for tat with armor, but that gives the commanders over there options. What we're seeing in the fighting in Ukraine is while hybrid warfare gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so, this hybrid warfare is backed with conventional armor forces. 85% of the losses of the Ukrainians have been to artillery and armor. And so we need to learn from that and just realize that with the light forces that we have over there left, we have the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, which is light armor, and we have an airborne brigade combat team, which is infantry. So we're suggesting that we go heel-to-toe continuous armor back in Europe, an allocated force that goes over there rotationally to maintain those relationships, give the commander some options, and bring some armor back in the fight, which may underpin kind of the credible part of deterrence. And then the last part of the research that we saw is the term regionally aligned force. And I don't know how familiar the audience is with the regionally aligned force concept, but as the Army is dealing with a strategy to resources mismatch, they started to align forces. It seems like a good idea and concept. I think it makes sense to want folks regionally aligned, but the problem is that you end up using the time, effort, training, the money to get them regionally aligned, but they aren't assigned or allocated to any region. They're just aligned, and that's not a real term in the global force management process for America. So there is potential that you get somebody ready and familiar with Europe, maybe even language training, and then you deploy them to Africa to respond to Ebola. And so that you've wasted that money, and as it's, the military is dealing with resource issues as well. So what we want to do is kind of make those more enduring, and so we're suggesting that we go back to assigning forces, allocating forces versus aligning them, and that's what we're going to talk, I think, later today at the Pentagon as well. So thanks for your time.
Alamo, thanks. Pat, let me turn to you next. Given some of the challenges that Alamo outlined in terms of getting enough forces within a time necessary to respond, the challenges of rotational presence, the lack of longstanding permanent presence of U.S. forces in Europe, what do you think the U.S. military can do with regard to the tools it has at its disposal in Europe? How can we perhaps better use what's already there?
Thanks, John. So Alamo kind of highlighted up front is that he looked at a lot of things, and as a group, we kind of spent some time looking at what force structure looks like in Europe. And as we just talked about, we're not expecting a huge force structure increase. We're looking for heel-toe rotational, leave the striker brigade that's there on the ground, and then there's an airborne brigade. If you kind of accept that that's all that's going to be there for a while, and I think given our political environment at home, that's probably the case, then how do you manage what you've got on the ground there? So we looked hard at conventional deterrence, and would like to highlight up front is we started to go down the nuclear deterrence to wrap it all into this, and it really became a project that was just too big to get our hands around. So we removed the nuclear aspect from the equation. And really talking about conventional deterrence. And as we looked at what are we trying to actually deter, so really kind of saw three Russian courses of action. And I'd like to talk about a couple of them, and then I'll give it to Kyle here to talk about the other one. Is really we saw the most dangerous, the most likely, to put it in military terms, and then a new kind of concept, and the most disruptive. I think the most disruptive first, just because it's kind of an interesting concept. It's tied to hybrid warfare, but that's where you don't actually cause any, your actions are just designed to disrupt what your enemy's trying to do. So on the Russian standpoint, it'd be something like, multiple snap exercises, cause the NAC to come together, debate, go back and forth, and really just kind of generate NATO fatigue among the members. So that's a disruptive course of action. Difficult to deter. We can talk about that if folks are interested later on, but really we've got the resilience of the alliance is what would actually have a deterrent effect there. And as we looked at the most likely course of action we saw as we looked would be the ambiguous warfare, hybrid, gray zone, would be that type of warfare. Much more likely they've had more success with that. The Russians have more recently. And then we looked at how you would deter that, and I'll let Kyle talk about that. And then really we talked about the most dangerous. In the military context, the most dangerous course of action is the one that you don't think is necessarily overly likely, but it's the one you have to account for because when it happens, it is the one that would cause the most destructive effect to your forces. And really from our standpoint, that would be a conventional Russian attack, cross-border incursion into a NATO ally, like in the Baltics. So how do you deter that? General Hodges, as most folks in the room have probably heard, they frequently talk about, he's the commander of the United States Army Europe, talks about making 30,000 troops look like 300,000. He does that because he's got 30,000 on the ground now. 300,000 is what we were in USER, United States Army Europe, at the height of the Cold War. And their way of doing that, and USER has pushed, is through exercises. We've been really working hard. You've seen money that's gone towards the European Reassurance Initiative. So we have been working hard to reassure our allies that we, the United States, is still there for them in the long run. Talking to NATO folks when we were over there, outside of the Americans, it seems like the alliance kind of gets reassurance at this point. We spend a lot of time reassuring them that we're still there. They get that commitment, and one of our big thoughts is that it's probably time to shift from NATO-based, allied-based reassurance to Russian-based deterrence, and then how you do that. And I've been kind of dancing around it. The best way we think to get after that is through theater security and cooperation, which is a U.S. term for all agents or all elements of national power, building up resilience, building up capability internal to our allies. And how do we better do TSC and theater security and cooperation? The exercises now, they're driven by a lot of different factors. They're driven by what the country itself would like to do. They're driven by what NATO would like them to do in the terms of capability targets, which are NATO-assigned objectives or capabilities, what the U.S. would like it to do, what the ambassador would like it to do. So there's multiple agencies that are working towards what each nation needs to be responsible for. And our role here, our view, is that we need to build a credible and capable deterrent force through the use of this TSC by nesting it and starting at one end with individual soldier skills and working all the way up to large-scale exercises. I won't say reforger because that gets folks nervous. That's not what we're talking about, but we are talking about large-scale exercises at the brigade level and higher. And in our discussions with USER recently, they absolutely see this in a similar light, is that's what's required. That just demonstrates a capability to the Russians that we have the ability to either deter by punishment, so that if they do come across, it's going to be quicker and more painful, and the A2AD bubble may not be as effective as they would like. And then also to show that by denial, because it's a capable force that's present throughout the Baltics and Eastern Europe, that there is a force there that would deny them to their ability to accomplish their objectives if they did decide to come across. So that theater security and cooperation is kind of the big thing that we looked at, as the ability to not just train the allies to hold on until the cavalry can get there, but to train allies in order to be capable of doing this as part of the alliance. And some things internal to NATO that we felt needed to be relooked a little bit. And some of these you may go, wow, that's a lot of work, or that's going to be a huge struggle. And I agree with you. I think some of these are going to be hard, but it's worth talking about. Certainly one of the first ones is the ability of SACEUR to reposition forces internal to Europe prior to an act decision. As you know now, a lot of cases he cannot do that. If he sees something, if we see indications and warning, he sees indications and warnings of something, of a Russian snap exercise, positioning German armor without concurrence from the NAC is a problem, because theoretically could be committing German funds in the form of moving fuel, ferries, or whatever, moving these elements around without approval. And the German Constitution doesn't allow for that. And understanding that, it may be time to revisit his authorities in a certain force. You know, he's got the very high readiness joint task force that he can do that with now, but with something with a little more punch behind it to be able to reposition forces prior to an act decision. Certainly not enter any kind of engagements, but to start moving forces around. And even if he doesn't exercise the authority, the fact that he has that could potentially have a deterrent effect. Also saw a deficiency as we talked to folks internal to Europe is multinational logistics capability doesn't really exist. Internal to NATO, logistics is a national responsibility. Certainly the United States doesn't have the logistics tail over there that it once did, and looking at some kind of hybrid or multinational logistics capability would enable operations to go on for a longer duration other than the 72 hours of stuff that's typically uploaded that deploys with the troops. And then internal to EUCOM, some recommendations: nested theater security cooperation, which we talked about, building it all the way up to a major exercise. I think there's a exercise that will happen this summer in June. Will happen in Poland, Anaconda 16, which is a huge. It was the Polish national exercise that now USER is participating in, and actually nations from all across Europe are participating in it. But interestingly enough, it's not actually being run by NATO. It's a Polish exercise, and it's kind of a coalition of the willing. Better way for us to demonstrate resolve is to actually have the NATO headquarters that currently exist to run that exercise in order to show that the center of gravity, which is the alliance for Europe there, to show that it is a viable capability. I think I'll pause there, John, and see if you've got any follow-ups. I don't want to go too long now. I'll leave something open for the questions.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks, Pat. Let me actually turn to Kyle now and ask Kyle about this security cooperation toolbox, or what we think of as military-to-military engagement. It's really what we mean by security cooperation. The toolbox is kind of a large one, right? There are a number of tools within that that the U.S. and the allies can wield in terms of building capability, strengthening interoperability, building capacity. Are there particular focus areas you think that the U.S. and the allies need to pay more attention to than others?
Thank you, John, and thank you for all the lead into this question and the response to all of this, because it is not just a U.S. military perspective, it is a whole of government perspective. But to really understand it, you have to frame the environment that the forces that are operating within the theater understand. So as part of that, you have to incorporate all of those other elements of military and national power to understand it. And then you have to formulate a plan to be able to employ it, which Pat just spoke about. But there is kind of this already in progress right now with the state partnership programs that exist within Europe, and there's 70 countries that the U.S. partners with right now. That being said, there is a link between the elected officials and national officials within the alliance to state partnership programs back in the United States with the National Guard. So as we look at the problem set and we look at potential solutions, it is expanding upon those and expanding upon the capabilities of those forces and the exercise program that Pat just spoke about, because it is not just an active duty military formulation of a response or actions, but it is within our own military. A lot of the transportation and logistics is categorized and captured in our reserve forces. Well, we can expand upon that and take a whole of Army approach or a whole of military approach versus just the active duty forces, which hence brings those subject matter experts into the box for actioning, such as law enforcement. Because law enforcement right now in the reserve forces can bring a tremendous capability to expand upon the capabilities that we're already providing to them. Now, that relationship is already established, and we can continue to expand upon that with the exercises by bringing those key players into the exercise program for not only development, mentorship, and experiences, but also a conduit to, hey, if a national disaster occurs, they can call back to that state or those counterparts and say, hey, this is just what happened. What do you recommend? And then as we look at this, we talked about General Hodges and his challenges with a rotational force. Those relationships don't necessarily continue. And the one way we can benefit from a expansion of what is actually going on is by having the linkage and the ties to a allocated force to Europe. And Secretary of Defense Panetta spoke about this. It's not whether we win specific wars or how well we train our counterparts, but it is really the developmental path for them to be able to stand up and provide the sovereignty and the defense of their international recognized borders. So as we look at this challenge, it is not just a military perspective, it is definitely a whole of government approach. John, do you have anything else to add?
Well, let me ask you specifically about what you think this whole of government approach that you described in making perhaps better use of the state partnership program. Are there specific avenues of or lines of effort that you think ought to be emphasized through or with the state partnership program?
Well, John, the one thing I think we can build upon right now is, as of 2 years ago, the 162nd was a brigade formulated to train and provide trained resources to go forward in Iraq and Afghanistan as part of the provincial reconstruction teams. So the existence of a headquarters and a trained organization to provide trainers to other entities or other countries was there. I think we can expand upon that and bring that back, about a 500-man organization. And yes, that is a big M portion of it, but I think we institute and incorporate other elements such as the State Department, such as all of those other three-letter agencies with the subject matter experts that come and help provide training and assistance to those countries. And it's not to say it's the U.S. way. It is to say that we need to understand their environment, understand their countries, and then be able to tailor the training program to them. If we build and develop one per geographic combatant commander, and this is not just a challenge in Europe, but I think in Europe is where we start this program and then expand it to other geographic combatant commanders, which hence gets at the relationships. It definitely gets at the ability of that geographic combatant commander to have an element that provides the training and resources and linkage back to the United States government.
Thanks, Kyle. Tony, let me turn to you next. And let me ask you a similar question that I just asked Kyle. Given the challenges in terms of leveraging the forces that we have and trying to take a whole of Army approaches, in the words of Kyle, as well as a whole of government approach, what's your sense of what tools in the military toolbox should be better leveraged, should be used perhaps in a different way? What's your sense in terms of recommendations now that you can offer as well?
Certainly, as laid out by my colleagues here, the activities in Europe, they present a picture to audiences here domestically and in Europe and to Russia. And it paints a picture of resolve. It helps with the deterrence efforts. But the actions alone need to be communicated so that you got to communicate the intent so that there is no miscommunication, no miscalculation on both sides there in Europe. And so communicating this intent of what these activities mean is critical. And so therefore, one of the tools in our, as you put it, in our toolbox, is the ability to synchronize a strategic communications effort that speaks to what these activities mean. Kyle mentioned whole of government. One of the recent creations here in the United States was the Global Engagement Center over at the State Department, and that serves as a model where they're synchronizing. Again, it's specific to countering extremist ideology and the propaganda that comes from ISIL, but a similar coordinating function that includes what the Army has in theater, what NATO and what the U.S. European Command has, coupled with our State Department's efforts, a similar synchronizing entity can, one, explain to domestic audiences what all these activities mean. It also helps to clear up any misinformation or disinformation that is put out from our adversaries in the theater. And specifically, another thing within the Army that can be done, one of the things I noticed in the research was there's been a decrease in, well, first of all, in the Army, the specialists in information, of course, you have public affairs on one end. You have what was called PSYOP, now military information support. those MISO professionals, there's been a reduction on the staff of those individuals, and that needs to be reversed. For many years, senior Army leaders who absolutely recognize the need for increased information operations ask for more IO professionals, and that gets translated into a specific career field in the Army that exists, of which those individuals are charged with synchronizing information operations. Yet none of them grew up in the Army in their careers, or none of them were trained in actually doing public affairs or in conducting MISO. So there's been an increase in those staff positions, but not in the actual specialties of inform and influence in the form of public affairs and MISO. So there would be those two things that I would recommend: the synchronizing body that includes the whole of government, and specifically for the Army to reverse this trend of reducing the professionals who are experts in communicating and countering propaganda.
All right, Tony, thank you. And gentlemen, thank you all very much. You've given us a lot to chew on. And so I've asked a lot of questions already now. I want to turn it over to our audience here as well as our virtual audience. Again, if you're in the virtual audience and you want to send a question into the audience here, to the team here, tweet it to me at John R. Denny, and I'll make sure they get it. But let me ask first if there's anybody here in the live audience who would like to ask the team a question about their research, their findings, or their recommendations. Please just identify yourself and then ask away.
Well, welcome to USIP. I am also an Army War College student, but I'm a fellow in the United States Army, and I'm a PAO by trade, going to U.S. Army Europe to be the PAO for General Hodges. So thanks for coming. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the upcoming Warsaw Summit, and what outcomes can we possibly hope for to assist with deterring Russia? What are our partners in NATO, what we hope to get out of them as far as increasing of the GDP, hopefully to that 2%? Do you see any hope with the Warsaw Summit as far as outcomes, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll take it first. From the folks that we talked to over there, the biggest outcome that most folks on the NATO and the SHAPE side saw were going to be forced posture decisions. That's what they're really looking for. They're really hoping for, I think. What it's actually going to look like, I don't know, but I think the forced posture of how much is going to end up in Poland, what things are going to end up that look like in the Baltics, I think that is going to be the biggest thing that comes out of this summit. Talking to folks, the Wales Summit had some great output, came out of that. They're very hopeful that this time out of Warsaw that they're going to get some forced structure decisions or forced posture decisions that are going to affect the future. I don't know personally how much that's going to go. I know that they were all in kind of the preliminary stages of setting positions and working the agendas when we were there, and folks are playing their cards pretty close. As far as the GDP, I think that's going to become a theme again. They're going to get back to beating that drum. I think folks are starting to turn it back around a little bit. A couple of the bottom allies I know that have really started to push forward and get themselves back up to where they're supposed to be. But I don't know that we're going to see anything other than the normal, hey, you guys need to pay your bills.
If I could add on to that, it's an opportunity for the alliance to maintain some momentum. The momentum that was established at the Wales Summit with Readiness Action Plan to deliver on those initiatives that they set forth during the Wales Summit. And to the budget increase, it's an opportunity to increase that momentum. We've seen that it seems like that the trend for decreasing budgets has stopped. So budgets appear to either be flat or increasing. We just read in the news yesterday that the Germans are increasing their force strength by about 14,000. So those are all good trends. The alliance needs to continue to push those trends and not necessarily focus on quantity, but on quality.
All right, guys, I've got a follow-up question for you. We've seen in the news in the past couple of days that as part of the U.S. effort to increase its rotational presence in Europe, that we can expect the Brits and the Germans perhaps to contribute as well to a rotational presence in the Baltic states in particular. And there was a headline yesterday about 4,000 additional troops that NATO is going to bless as part of the Warsaw Summit. In response to that, Russia has announced that it's going to perhaps increase its strength in that part of Russia, or that part of northeastern Europe, by perhaps as much as 2 divisions. So all the recommendations that you made, particularly with regard to force structure, how does the West avoid this sort of security dilemma where one side's reassurance step looks like an escalation to the other side, or is that unavoidable in your view?
So I think there's going to be some of the tit for tat. That's just inevitable. What I think we can do, the alliance can do, is to avoid a large-scale force buildup on its western border. But what is key to that is, one, that the alliance does enhance and continue to develop its capabilities for the U.S. to focus on helping our allies to achieve their NATO capability targets that Pat addressed, and also for the alliance to grant SACEUR those authorities that Pat talked about. What that does is enables the alliance not to array forces along its eastern border, but to be able to mobilize and push forces in a timely manner should it need to.
Yeah, and then to kind of pile on as well, I think one of the things we've got to be careful about is how these exercises that I talked about, folks can read about in the paper, but one of the things to do is talk about what we build these things to be. Are they offensive maneuver type operations, or are they primarily focused on defense? And I think one of the messages we've got to be careful. I think the Russians are going to make noise no matter what we do, but we've got to advertise these as more defensive in nature. Certainly, as on the PAO front, would be, we're enabling the defense of sovereign country, and the exercises, the scripting, even the enemy threat scenarios all need to be based against defending the territory of a sovereign nation, as opposed to being offense and having that spun back on us. And that helps us, at least, I think, a little bit in the court of world opinion. It may not necessarily help us with the Russians, but I think as we move forward, that's one of the things we looked at, is the design of those exercises needs to be something that's primarily defensive in nature, if that makes sense. And then I think the other one to touch on as well is, Kyle kind of hit on it, is what the most likely is this hybrid thing, and how do you deter against that? The tit for tat, deterrence by punishment. If you catch them at it, I guess, but that the attribution, as we talk to the allies, to everybody there in Europe, seem to be a very huge challenges. So really, if you can't get the attribution, then you've got to deter by denial, making it unable for them to accomplish their objectives. And that's where we looked at building resilient partners, and that's a theme in NATO currently, and I think that actually will probably be a discussion at the Wales Summit as well, is resiliency, to not the Article 5 issues, but to the Article 3, keeping your own house in order. So SCADA attacks against dams, going after, gas pipelines. How do we, as a nation, help countries work their internal defense so that they can actually have a deterrent effect, because the Russians won't be able to accomplish what they're going after, if that makes sense. And that, I think, keeps you out of the tit for tat, how many tanks do I have versus how many tanks do you have?
And just one more thing to that, it goes to what Tony was talking about, is we need to maintain an open dialogue with Russia. And the alliance has a venue to do that through the NATO-Russia Council, which just met a couple weeks ago. Of course, since the first time since 2014, of course, there really wasn't a whole lot there. But that is an established fora in which we can communicate exactly what our intent is, and inviting Russia to participate as observers in these exercises, I think, is key. So they clearly understand through our intent that these are defensive operations, because we have a commitment to the alliance for collective defense.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing as well. I think the strategic messaging is probably the most effective tool we can use against a hybrid warfare. If we look at the classic Gerasimov doctrine that Russia uses, they stir up the Russian diaspora, those folks that speak Russian in the Baltics and all over former Soviet Union countries. They incense them, they aggregate them, and they use that as a cry for help from the diaspora for Russia to come in and intervene militarily. So if we can get the NATO message out that these are defensive type of exercise and really open the lines of communication, that keeps the diaspora in check, and that effectively neutralizes the Russia hybrid style of warfare.
Let me ask another follow-up question about this issue of resources appropriate for the challenge. If the most likely threat involves, Jay, some of the things you just described about Russians perhaps exploiting Russian-speaking minorities in certain countries in Eastern Europe, what's your sense of whether and how the force structure responses, is that sufficient? Are those a necessary but maybe insufficient part of the response? In other words, how can we use tools that we have there. I think maybe part of the answer is some of the things that Pat was talking about in security cooperation. But what I'm after is whether and how force structure changes really get at the most likely challenges. What's your sense of the appropriateness of the response?
Well, I don't know that the force structure recommendations we've got actually get after the hybrid threat as well. I think what more importantly is a part of our component of this paper is we look at how we're actually using the forces that we already have a little bit better. And Kyle talked on it. He did a great job of highlighting it. Is if you talk about foreign internal defense, Article 3 type things is, governance, free and fair elections, hardening your computer systems against attack. How do we do that? And that we think these are all things that are kind of a whole of government approach, and that's where kind of the dime fill, if you want to talk those terms. But the instruments of national power, using those as a mechanism to ensure that the nations are able to kind of keep themselves together. So before the Russian attribution comes, or before we're able to attribute it necessarily to the Russians, is keeping the nations that need the help together. One of the great ways to do that is a state partnership program that Kyle talked about, is that we have guys that are there, they're National Guardsmen that frequently have skill sets that don't exist in the regular Army. A lot of these guys are policemen, a lot of these guys have experience in city planning and things like that, is leveraging those skills until we can get the whole of government kind of interagency approach going, is to leverage those skills to build resilient allies. They're able to absorb this stuff. We're able to beat it away so that they're not able to have the Russians incense a minority and cause civil unrest, and then use that as a pretense to go in and actually invade. So I think it's not necessarily about force structure in that case, John. I think it's much more about using the forces that we have or the capabilities that exist, using those a little bit better.
If I could add just one thing there, though, I mentioned earlier that the hybrid problem is getting a lot of attention. I think it's what worries us because we don't necessarily, it's a little bit fuzzy, we don't know how to handle it. But at the end of the day, I mean, the Russians have used conventional land power to back up that. So if the ethnic speaking Russians in the Baltic states are getting upset, I mean, at some point there's got to be Russian forces that come in there, whether or not they're wearing uniforms, whether or not they're dressed like Russians. I think is one of the things that concerns us. But that's a unique capability of land power. You can shoot down an airplane and say it wasn't you. You can load up humanitarian supplies and say it wasn't you. But when you come across and you shoot or engage somebody on the ground, I mean, that's where land power really, gets its leverage. I mean, you can see the person, you can now get an engagement with the person, whatever. So we're hoping, we don't ever want to fight this. This is something we don't ever want to get involved in. And so I would suggest that if we make these force structure changes and we continue the momentum of the great things that came out of the Wales Summit, that's going to kind of change the calculus for Russia. And maybe the cost goes up. And now he doesn't come and respond to the ethnic speaking Russians there that are, now making some kind of issue. So I think land power force structure changes may in fact influence that in some roundabout way, if you will.
There are, going to the whole of government piece, there are two processes out there that should be perhaps better coordinated so that a U.S. government approach is really getting at what those challenges are. And one of those is each of our U.S. Embassy country teams have what's called an integrated country strategy. And the Department of Defense representatives on those country teams have a say into how those are developed and what are the specific objectives the country team is working on. And the nice thing about that integrated country strategy, it includes all the U.S. agencies and departments that are parts of that country team. But what needs to be done better is integrating and synchronizing the security elements of those integrated country strategies with U.S. European Command's theater security strategy, particularly the country-specific security cooperation plans that really focus on EUCOM's efforts with each individual country. And this is done, but it needs to be done in a more effective way such that we are helping our allies and our partners to focus on where they lack in capabilities, helping them focus on their NATO capability targets, and also helping them to build that internal resiliency that we've been talking about.
No tweets yet. If you've got a a question in our virtual audience, you can again tweet that to @JohnRdenny. But I've got a question for you guys. I'll follow up on something that Reed just mentioned, and that is the role of NATO. Can you guys describe for us how you address in your book how NATO fits into this? Reed mentioned the NATO capability targets, and then that's sort of it's a little bit esoteric. But in terms of how NATO plans its defenses for how it defines its missions on a routine or regular basis. NATO establishes capability targets for each of its member states, right? So I think you mentioned in the book, and you mentioned here today, U.S. making better use of those things. Is there another way in which NATO fits into this, or the alliance processes fit into the recommendations?
I think the challenge for the alliance where it needs to do better is its the speed of decision. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about pushing back and assigning to Europe a 2-star joint task force capable headquarters to not only manage all of our theater security cooperation, but also to serve as a warfighting headquarters should it need to. And part of the reason for that is because the timeline for the alliance to make a decision is much longer than the United States timeline is. However, if they can expedite their processes, give the SACEUR those authorities that Pat talked about, and enable the alliance to even make interim decisions, I think that is a key role that the alliance must play. Another key role that the alliance can and should play is a logistics capability. During the Cold War, the United States had a lot of logistics capability and infrastructure in Europe, and we still have a fair bit of infrastructure, but those delivery capabilities are mostly resident back in the United States, and the time-distance challenge to getting those from the United States over to Europe could be too long. So, but if the alliance develops such a capability, or enhance it, it has some capability, but if it enhanced its capabilities to provide a holistic logistics capability for the alliance, that would mitigate that time-distance challenge that the U.S. would have in providing those logistics for initial entry forces.
Yeah, and obviously NATO's got a huge role in this. It's not a U.S. solution. It can't be. When you say you need 30,000 to look like 300,000, you kind of go back and go, well, there's actually 450,000 uniformed NATO members that are running around Europe. So we need to make this a little less U.S.-centric and much more NATO-centric. The speed of decision is a huge one. I think we've kind of talked about that one several times, and giving SACEUR some additional authorities would help with some of this. And then, Alma talked about, conventional deterrence and how conventional footprint and increased armor can have that conventional deterrent capability, and that's true. But also the ISAF model, we spent a lot of time in Europe lately and a lot of dollars training on this ISAF capability, where guys going in Afghanistan, they were able to train up on, counterinsurgency fit. A lot of those skill sets would translate over if we could continue some of that and redirect some of that at the NATO level in terms of building resilience internal to NATO allies. So NATO allies would be able to take that same skill set and use that internal to their own countries. And that's something I think, as I've seen a couple papers come out recently about, internal resilience to get around but to kind of the Article 3 issue of keeping yourself in order, making sure that you can defend your own borders. I think that resilience is going to have to be something that NATO gets involved with, and maybe that's a capability target that's assigned to somebody and they train. I think Italian, the Estonians have got some of the computer stuff going. Things like that I think would be helpful from a NATO perspective, is enabling the partners or the allies as opposed to just saying, hey, that's your responsibility.
Hey, John, if I just add one last thing on that. The 3 core tasks for NATO are collective defense, cooperative security, and crisis management. But in the end, what's going to be most effective is a unified alliance, capable conventional forces, and a resilient alliance, particularly with each individual country. I think those are our 3 key pillars that you could perhaps add around as core tasks.
And I'd like to add one other thing to that is all of the centers of excellence that are being developed there within the NATO structure. Leveraging those to actually provide value to the countries that exist there. Because right now, like Estonia, they do have a center of excellence for cyber defense. But that is only a schoolhouse. It is not necessarily the benefit of what it provides and how it can put forces or structures in place for those countries. It is just the schoolhouse. So that is just one example of how we can expand upon that to be able to provide value added to those countries that exist there, and there is a threat, a credible threat, to their defenses.
Asking questions, but anyway. So, a story came out from Mark Perry, and I should know he's a freelance writer. It came out today or late yesterday. I don't know if you saw it, talking about recent testimony from General McMaster, early April, and he quoted senior officials within the Pentagon, but didn't name those senior officials. That said, it's the Army kind of saying the sky's falling again, that the threat isn't that bad over there. It's just their way of trying to get more money, keep more people, add to their force structure. What did you guys get as far as when you were doing your research for your book and for over the last few months that you've been working, as far as from DoD officials within the Pentagon, not just from Europe and NATO and USAR, but what did you hear as far as feedback from the Pentagon, from those officials? Did they push back on what you guys were asking about, or your findings, or were they positive, or what did they say?
I'll start out. It's a good thing. We hear that. You hear that a lot, and the saying, never let a crisis pass you up, right? It's well known throughout the world. But I'll tell you, if you just look at the Whale Summit, and I mentioned all the events that are going on, if you look what came out of the Whale Summit, I don't want to speak for everybody in here, but we were proud, I think, as an alliance of the stuff that came out of there, to the fact that we're increasing the size of the NATO response force. We created a whole new high-speed, very high readiness joint task force. And so the alliance is paying attention. I mean, the alliance is this is real for the alliance. So when the president goes to Estonia and says, you have the full backing of the U.S. military, I think it's important for military leadership to make sure that we are ready for that. And so I don't think it's just a posturing for force structure for money. I'm an airman, and I'm making the suggestion for increased force structure here because I think the alliance is nervous in Eastern Europe, and I think it's a real tangible issue that we're dealing with. So we need to be ready as a force, and that's what we're recommending, and that's the kind of things that we're hearing around. This is what an American Army is struggling with, some of these things, and so we're trying to give them the capability they need.
And to kind of, I guess, more directly answer the question, we didn't hear a lot of pushback at all. As you start talking, I think folks kind of realize, and like Alma talked about, the force recommendations here are not ridiculously huge. I mean, it would be a challenge, but it's not. We're not talking about sending 270,000 back over there to get it back up to 300,000. I think almost everyone that I can think of that we've talked to understood that something had to be done, that the status quo wasn't working, and we needed to kind of change angles there. And we did not get very much pushback out of anybody that I can think of.
And even though we focus on the threat from Russia, and Alamo mentioned at the beginning that there are other threats, the migrant crisis, and so our approach to dealing with Russia will also enhance the alliance's capabilities to deal with all the other threats that they are facing now and could face in the future. And bottom line is, we got to be prepared.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today your analysis, your recommendations, your thoughts on this challenge. Your book is a major contribution to the debate over whether and how the U.S. continues to provide for its security interests in Europe. Probably not so much a question whether, but how we do that. And the book, as I mentioned, Strategic Landpower and a Resurgent Russia, an Operational Approach to Deterrence, is going to be available for downloading at the Strategic Studies Institute website in just another week or two. We invite you to take a look at that and to comment on it as well. So without any further comment, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panelists for presenting to us today.